Power Macintosh G5 was introduced June 23, 2003. Discontinued August 7, 2006. They used the PowerPC 970 processor by IBM, running between 1.6 and 2.7 GHz. They had from 256 to 512 megabytes of RAM installed. If you want to escape the crazy world of retro computer pricing and just tinker with an old Mac like a true enthusiast, the G5 Tower is a good choice. As of 2024 anyway. I find that even if they don't work, and many don't, they make great looking shelving supports. Or even using them as storage for my valuables. My Patreon supporters voted the Power Macintosh G5 the machine they most wanted to see me do a video on. Way to go, folks. Mac Addict magazine had a great cover showing how not cute the G5 Tower was compared to the original Mac. A special issue celebrating how far the Macintosh had come in the 20 years since the introduction. And here we are now, 20 years beyond that. Apple's first completely metal-based tower had a commanding presence. And it wasn't just cheap painted sheet metal like some of the early 90s Macintosh computers, or most any PC.
This really brings Christmas close to a person.
The G5 was made significantly taller than the G4, giving that visual superiority. And taller than even the Quadra 900 series tower, though that's thanks to the handles and raised feet. The cabinet size was still larger on the Quadra. The Power Macintosh G5 was even featured in the A&E series Intervention, where they demonstrate the usefulness of the handles.
Call the police. Go ahead and call the police.
The handles were a carryover from the G4, but because the case is metal, the corners are very sharp, cutting into your hands. But what are you going to do to get around that? It's metal, I mean... Okay, well that's a good idea. When it came to Apple's metal enclosures, the titanium PowerBook G4 led the charge when it was released to great excitement in 2001. The popularity of the PowerBook G4 ensured Apple would move to high-quality metal enclosures across their entire line in the future. It's even where that cool power button originated that's on the G5. But now looking back at it, frankly compared to the more modern unibody models, seems more like a prototype. It's a bit...
Looks like you built it yourself!
No, come on old-timer, it's not that bad. I was pretty impressed with the new case design, but I never bought one. I upgraded my G4's processor instead, from 400 MHz to 1.2 GHz with a Sonnet replacement daughter card. The closest I got to a G5 was this magnetic corkboard. The Power Mac G4 era was a mind-bendingly convoluted series of 28 models with confusing names. And by the way, I mentioned this in my iMac SL video. That's where I indicated the G4 667 was never actually made. A viewer corrected me, sending a picture of his, the manufacturing sticker, and even included a picture of the processor engraving itself so I couldn't counterclaim Apple just substituted 733 MHz chips to fill the few orders they got before they discontinued it. Anyway, compared to all that, the G5 series was relatively straightforward. Good, better, and best tiers, and 4 distinct product releases. Simple, except for 2 rogue models screwing it up. So I'll ignore them until we have to talk about them. I won't be focusing solely on a particular model just because there wasn't that much diversity in the Power Macintosh G5 series, especially in outward appearance. Let's start though by looking at the first generation entry level, a single 1.6 GHz processor based model. I picked one up for $50 during the COVID-19 pandemic. The unit was sitting on the front step. I was instructed to put the money in the mailbox, take it, and go. The hard drive of this 1.6 has been removed, which the seller was very clear on, and 2 GB RAM, not 2 MB, because that's ridiculous. So I'm installing one from another G5 that had been simply erased. You need these special rubberized roundhead screws so the hard drive will slide into place on the bay rails. Hard drives had to be serial ATA, which was new to the Mac, and that's a pretty simple connection.
And 2 serial ATA buses for ultra-fast internal storage.
Those are parallel ATA, Phil. I downloaded the original OS X installer disk from Macintosh Garden and made my own DVD install disk. As it turns out, the optical drive is bad, so I'm swapping it out for a good one. Come on. A case this big and I feel like I'm working in the Quadra 800. Here, I don't want this. With the hard drive in, even though it's blank and formatted, the G5 doesn't see it. You need to open Disk Utility as soon as the installer launches from the DVD and officially erase the hard disk, which will properly format it so the G5 can see it. Now I can install the original OS. Ooh. Okay, I'll get back to that. The G5 Tower would be the first Macintosh to use the G5 processor. It replaced the so-called Power Macintosh G4 FireWire 800 release from January 2003, including the fastest G4 tower ever, the dual 1.42 GHz. Besides just clock speed, that dual G4 is inferior to the single 1.6 G5 in almost every way. The most important reason? 167 MHz versus 800 MHz bus. Huge difference thanks to Apple's newly designed controller chip, also manufactured by IBM.
It's the G5 system controller, and it's among the world's fastest ASICs.
And called the U3 integrated circuit. To get to 1.42 GHz, the G4 chip runs at 8.5 times the bus speed, with the diminished returns of doing that. The 1.6 was simply clock doubled. The main reason to cling to a pre-2003 G4 was to be able to run OS 9 natively after Steve Jobs ceremoniously buried it in 2002, with a coffin on stage.
macOS 9 is survived by his next generation, macOS 10, and thousands of applications, most of them legitimate.
Theatrics that Tim Cook does not do. Starting with those last FireWire 800 G4s and forward onto the G5, OS 9 apps would only run in classic mode, which was OS 9 running as an application in OS 10, not for professional use. At a $19.99 suggested retail price, Apple's entry-level G5 was expensive compared to the entry-level G4s of the past, making it a bigger commitment for the low-end buyers. Now let's compare the current entry price for a Mac Tower. I'm not going to even bother adjusting for inflation. Power Mac sales had been steadily declining over the G4 era, and the G5 would provide the sales boost Apple desperately needed. Steve Jobs personally introduced the G5 Tower.
There is one more thing we wanted to talk about today. Here it is. This is an all-aluminum enclosure that is super high-tech and can handle the power, both processing power and thermal power, generated by such an architecture and its follow-ons to come. I've left the door open off the side so you can see this thing. It is a thing of beauty. And massive branch prediction logic, which I don't know what it does, predicts branches. I don't know. But it's a good thing.
His keynotes were wonderfully personable, like a friend showing you a cool piece of technology. That died with him. Tim Cook was bland enough, and during and after the pandemic, they got even worse with sterile recorded presentations.
It's already been a big day, but we do have one more thing.
The keynotes are now very polished and shallow, a highly rehearsed message lacking in spontaneity, but at least dedicated to equal representation.
Hi, I'm Anna, and I work at Ableton as a software developer. Principal Product Manager at Adobe for motion graphics.
I'm Ruby at Vectorworks.
I'm Ellie Wade, and I work at Maxon.
Larissa Supnick. I'm the lead Sapphire developer,
3D designer, and I specialize in fabric simulation.
So the G5 Keynote is a comforting reminder of a bygone era at Apple.
I'm going to pick bulge here. We're going to just waste an awful lot of productivity here.
Leading up to the G5 introduction, all software developers that mattered had released an OS X version of their key software. Even Slowpoke Quark released an OS X version of Quark Express publishing software just before the G5 introduction. Even though the G5 was introduced in June 2003, they would not ship until the month of August, starting with the 1.6 GHz, then the 1.8, until finally the 2 GHz with dual processors released toward the end of the month. Apple, for their part, re-released the 1.25 GHz mirror drive door G4 model from 2002 in a single processor 1299 configuration, and had it available for a full year between the first and second G5 generations, just to support OS IX's Pro users. You could also order a dual 1.25, and according to Macworld, that would cost you more than the top-end G5. But this is the only reference I saw to that, so Apple may have corrected the pricing after this was pointed out. And we're still waiting on that install. Okay, in the meantime, here's an overview of the rest of the G5 series specs. The towers became all dual in the second generation and bumped up processor speed. Third generation bumped up again. Fourth generation, similar clock but with dual-core processors, and with 2 dual-core processors at the top end, known simply as the G5 Quad. Finally, a product name that's not a sentence long. Anyway, back to the first generation. The G5 shipped with the Jaguar OS, macOS 10.2.7, a version released specifically for the G5 tower. 10.3 Panther would soon follow, released in October, and this is back when new versions meant huge improvements. On the other hand, you paid $129 for the new version. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. Oh, here we go. Okay, installation of 10.27 is complete, and we get an OS X welcome video. This intro was used in every version of OS X up until this point, so getting pretty stale, and 10.2 was the last time they'd use it. Unfortunately, the music fades before you can get your groove on. What comes with the install? You get iMovie 3, yeah, that version, iPhoto 2, iTunes 4, and iChat 1. In iChat, you could start assembling your list of buddies. I haven't seen an Apple menu selection that weird since Fatbits and McPaint. The iSight webcam, also announced during the same keynote, along with iChat AV coming with Panther.
It's available today. To all of the developers here at the conference, we want to say a very special thank you. We're going to be giving you an iSight camera today.
The iSight design was really cool and clearly influenced by this magnetic corkboard. With the new G5, you got standard white Apple keyboard and Apple mouse in clear acrylic casings. By now, Apple had figured out how to avoid the white plastic from turning yellow like the iMac G4 devices did. You got a USB extension cord to let you keep the G5 under the desk, and an adapter to convert the digital DVI output to analog S video out and composite video out. That's cool. We had no way to do that on Tower Macs since like the beige G3s were discontinued, unless you got a special add-on. Thanks to Tristan for sending this all the way from Australia. I didn't have one because with any G5 you buy today on the used market, You'll be lucky if you even get a power cord with it. Now I can connect the G5 output to a TV, a video recorder, or an American Idol karaoke machine. Here's OS X on the 4-inch black and white CRT screen. Pretty cool. Hey, I should have done a whole video about this. Look, I know the video preview is an exaggeration, but yeah. Why do they always put my clickbait videos into breaking world news? By the way, the camera is nowhere near the quality of the eyesight. The AV adapter later became a separate purchase, and in its place a DVI to VGA adapter, which was great for things like digital projectors. Bad news for American Idol karaoke machine. Now, front-side ports were a completely new thing for an Apple product, and extremely practical. If we look around back, we have gigabit Ethernet. No airport wireless built in because it's a tower. It should have access to hardwire Ethernet. But wireless was an option for $99. What's the point of this setup, Apple? That was the Airport Extreme card, supporting the new faster 802.11g standard. This 1.6 has one actually. The card is plugged in just above the RAM. Smaller than the original 1999 Airport card and obviously incompatible. It required this special antenna so it could pick up the wireless signal outside the metal enclosure. I always pictured these antennas being more substantial. The FCC warns do not get within 1 centimeter of this thing while transmitting. What's the worst that can happen? Oh. With the 4th generation G5, the antenna was built in as a long plastic rail, and it's an easy way to identify a 4th gen if you're shopping the used market. Though it wasn't found to be all that effective an antenna in practice.
It is the world's first 64-bit desktop processor. And it runs our existing 32-bit applications natively, no problems at all.
PowerPC chips were a 64-bit architecture from the start back in 1991 when it was designed. Up until the G5, the PowerPC chips that Apple used ran a 32-bit subset of that. Apple's original PowerPC roadmap had the full 64-bit PowerPC 620 for servers and workstations on the horizon. But it was ultimately never used by Apple, opting for the 32-bit 604 and 604E. 64-bit was ambitious for 1997, but that was typical for Apple. Making the PowerPC 970 the first 64-bit implementation that Apple or anyone else used in a personal computer. Still, the OS X kernel was not 64-bit, and applications that took advantage were rare for a long time. 10.3 Panther was at least 64-bit aware, but it took until 10.6 Snow Leopard to finally get a 64-bit kernel. The G5 was gone by that point and won't even run Snow Leopard, so 64-bit mattered very little in the end. It took years to properly implement 64-bit systems. For example, Apple dropped 32-bit application support in 2019 to force developers to convert any remaining apps to 64-bit, unfortunately breaking any 32-bit apps that were no longer supported by the developer. 10.14 Mojave highlighted the so-called legacy apps whose days were numbered. The G5 towers took immediate advantage of 64-bit breaking through the 4GB memory barrier, yet the low end was still restricted to a RAM ceiling of 4GB. Not only for the 1.6, but for the first 3 generations, where the others got an 8GB capacity with double the RAM slots. The 4th generation could take 16GB RAM regardless of the model thanks to a higher capacity RAM type. Okay, we don't need the sound effect. In fact, it's a waste to even have 4GB RAM on a 32-bit system when only 2 to 2.5GB would be available due to memory mapping overhead. The G4 is topped out at 2GB for this reason. RAM is dual channel and has to be added in matched pairs again. One in the top bank and one in the lower bank in a mirrored sequence. With PCI slots, it was the same pattern. The low end was PCI only for the first 3 generations, where the higher end models got a high-speed PCI-X capability. Everything went from parallel to serial connections in the 4th generation with PCI Express, a very new and incompatible standard to PCI and PCIX, still used today. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Stop! Hey, speaking of expansion slots, in 1997 an epic battle broke out between professional Mac users and Apple. It started with the discontinuation of the 6 PCI slots that were in the 9500 and 9600s, the replacement G3 tower being released with only 3 slots. Many 9000 series users would maintain their machines for years longer than they wanted to just because of this cutback at the beginning of the Steve Jobs era. Basically, Emilio's Apple built well-stocked, high-quality machines in an attempt to win back customer confidence after the damage done by his predecessor. Steve Jobs' Apple was quietly clawing back some of that value, looking to cut controllable build costs. When the blue and white G3 tower was released, they declared 4 slots.
4 slots. We are going to 4 slots.
Okay, some compromise from Apple. Wait a minute. The base G3 tower had motherboard video which was removed in the blue and white G3. So discrete video cards became the only option, not just a power user add-on. Apple shouldn't have counted the extra slot when it was required and designated for a video card. That's why the others are called expansion slots. In 2001, Apple revamped the Power Mac's internal design with the digital audio G4.
And all models now have 5 slots. We've been short-selling ourselves. We've been telling the world we had 3 slots.
We are going to 4 slots.
But the whole PC world counts the graphics slot as well. And so, the way everybody else counts slots, we've had 4 slots. We are upping the AGP to 4x, and we are adding a 4th PCI slot so that every Power Mac now has 5 slots.
The audience was not buying Steve's 5th slot explanation. But still, they finally added a real 4th expansion slot. There, now we can all rest. Wait, 1, 2, 3. Dude! In the 2019 Mac Pro Tower, there are 8 slots. Okay, let's not get nuts. All models had a super drive with DVD burner capability, where it was previously reserved only for the top-tier G4 model. Easy access to the interior was maintained from the blue and white G3 and G4 tower design, but this time a precisely fit, fully removable door that snaps in place so cleanly and satisfyingly, it feels like high technology. And the security locking option is so simple. Under the door you find the model sticker at the bottom. Some argued with me on earlier videos indicating that they have a special edition of a G4 that I didn't mention, and proof was the sticker. That just means it was a custom order, not a rare standard model. The stickers are print to order. For example, here's a G5 first generation top-end unit. They include obvious things like keyboard and mouse, OS X, and so the description runs right off the end of the sticker. I don't know who was running the label machine that day.
Just do anything?
Really, no one was following a standard format. Another example, the super drive is interchangeably called Super, SD, or DVDR/CDRW. And that's just looking at the first-gen machines that I have. Once the side panel is off, simply remove the air shield, the main fan, and you have clear access to the components you would need. RAM, expansion slots, video card, clock battery, hard drives, DVD drive, CUDA switch, and all without tools. It's like we're back in the Mac 2CX days. Well, to a point.
And we have a fully assembled Macintosh 2CX here. And
if you're trying to remove the G5 motherboard, then forget that. Let's talk about these CPU caps. Stylized interior elements are a rare step for Apple. The 8600, 9600, and beige G3 towers with the interior colored plastic handles were the closest that I've seen, but those were functional. And the G3 all-in-one from that same time was definitely not going for interior style. What the hell? The G5 heatsink caps were clearly there for aesthetics, and featured heavily in Apple's under-the-hood marketing. Okay, I don't recommend doing that. I mean, it's better than putting the logo on the outside of the case. The G5 shared the same daughter card processor design as the G4, connecting to the motherboard with a 300-pin connector, which had allowed processor upgrades like mine and many others. However, Apple ensured that third-party upgrades for the G5 daughter card were not possible this time around. Not that it mattered in retrospect. Unfortunately, those caps are actually hiding the massive cooling demands of the G5. If I remove the daughter card, you can see the serious bulk of the heatsink. The first generation G5 caps require care when removing them. You'll need to release these 4 tiny clips from the holes in the heatsink. The Xserve G5 and iMac G5 would follow suit and use the same cap style. The CPU covers evolved from these individual caps to a single plate with just a groove divider in the second and third generations, and to a single large G5 logo for the dual-core 4th generation. To take the large plate covers off, you need to remove this plastic pin by prying with a blade. And remove the plastic sleeve by screwing into it with something threaded and pulling it out. But beware, you'll be voiding your warranty by doing so. So the function for Apple seems to be for tamper evidence. Push the plate to the left and pull it away. Looks the same as the first generation at that point. Note that you have to put the sleeve and the pin back on the water-cooled units. More on those later. This 1.6 is one of the few single CPU models and did not need the space for the second processor, second fan, or the 8 RAM slots like you did with the dual processor. And don't think you're just going to plug in a second processor. There's no socket there. The top-end dual 2 GHz processor machine must have been the most popular just based on how many I see on the used market. This was also indicated by Apple changing things up with the lower-end models just 3 months after release. The 1.6 price reduced by $200, and for the 1.8 mid-model, Apple reconfigured it with a second processor and added only $100 to the price. There's one of the rogue models. August and into September 2003, computer stores received demo units. Here, store technicians unpacked the tower for display. All the while, this enormous Final Cut Express box looks on. This was still in the glory days of Apple retail. Around this time, Microsoft quietly approached IBM to design a PowerPC chip to drive their next-generation Xbox game console, the Xbox 360. The chip would be architecturally similar to the PowerPC 970, so Microsoft purchased a bunch of top-end G5 towers in October 2003 to make alpha game development systems. Here's a picture that a Microsoft contractor snapped and posted of the G5s arriving at Microsoft. He was probably taking a picture of the pallet that fell apart during delivery, but maybe should not have publicly posted it. He was fired, which just drew more unwanted attention to Microsoft's game system plans, and dredging up memories of their recently settled employment ethics lawsuit, hiring permanent temporary workers so they didn't need to pay benefits. Note how the towers were initially packed horizontally in the box. Horizontal packing would soon be changed to vertical, which to me is better, though I don't know Apple's reasoning behind the change. Also note the trolley where someone spray painted free rides. In November 2003, Apple... wait, that's not a thing. What's with the hair? Oh, this is part of Apple's 1987 video series of what they thought 2003 would look like for education. They got the flat panel monitors right.
I need to do a library search.
What is the subject?
I need an illustration of a medieval weapon used in Scotland. Let me see a close-up of this sword. That's outrageous.
It's outrageous. That's a good guess at what future kids might say, but the actual expression kids would use in the new millennium is, it's the
The resolution on the screen and what's presented should get more and more like live television with its fine graphics and actors for presentation reasons.
Hey, Macbeth's at the gate. Press the button, alright?
In December 2003, Virginia Tech revealed that they had built a supercomputer from 1100 top-end dual-processor G5s.
So the first 1100 was quite a few, and we had to piss off a few other customers. I'm sorry, but we went ahead and did it.
Named System X, it was found to be the third fastest supercomputer in the world at that time, built at a fraction of the cost because it used off-the-shelf hardware. Definitely something Apple did not hesitate to brag about. After all this, Steve was quite confident in the G5 going into 2004, the year they would ship the Xserve G5 and iMac G5. Apple had flipped the script from what they were saying during the G4 era.
But megahertz does not equal performance. It's just a contributing factor to performance.
Everybody gets hung up on clock speed, but what really counts is balanced system performance.
IBM and Apple are today announcing that within 12 months, we'll be at 3 gigahertz. 3 gigahertz processor clock, that's up 50% within 12 months. And so, believe me, this architecture has legs.
How'd that work out?
The G5 is our future roadmap in processors. I want to talk about 2.5 gigahertz because I stood up here a year ago and said we'd have 3 gigahertz within a year. And we'll keep striving for that 3 gigahertz. One of these days we'll make it. But we're doing pretty well relative to the rest of the industry. I stood up here 2 years ago in front of you, and I promised you this. And we haven't been able to deliver that to you yet. We can envision some amazing products we want to build for you. And we don't know how to build them with the future PowerPC roadmap.
How did something so promising go so wrong? It all came down to heat dissipation, and Apple started in a bad place. A tower this big that could only hold 2 hard drives and 1 optical drive was already suspicious, considering the G4 could hold double that. Based on the IBM Power 4 server processor, the G5 chips ran hot. Unlike this transistor radio with 6 transistors, the PowerPC 970 contained 58 million transistors. I don't know if anyone watching has heard of Moore's Law, but it states that the number of transistors and resistors on a chip will double every 24 months. Moore's Law was not a gradual thing. It happened in steps called process generations. The last G4 processor used 180 nanometer transistors, the G5 was 130 nanometer, and all chip manufacturers were gearing up for 90 nanometer going into 2004, including IBM. Dennard scaling had been the engine behind Moore's Law for decades. So imagine this electrical symbol is a transistor in your computer chip. Yeah, I know it's not exactly the right symbol. By Dennard scaling, with each process generation, they shrink the transistor size 30%, allowing them to have double the transistors on the same size die. And, this is key, no increase in power requirement. Also, because the transistors are now physically smaller and interconnects are shorter, clock frequency jumps 40%. It was easy, as shown in this formula. And Intel was best at it because all they cared about was raising clock frequency because it was a simple spec that naive consumers understood meant faster.
Go to games.
A number of factors conspired to bring about the end of Dennard scaling in 2004, but it's mostly attributed to leakage current. It's hard to keep electron flow in place when the barriers are only atoms thick. It leaks off as heat, and a lot of it from circuits that are idle. Now they had reached the point where they had maxed out the cooling that they could economically put in the computer to protect the chip from its own heat. So adding more power to the chip to make up for leakage current was no longer an option. Any attempt at pushing transistors harder by increasing clock frequency just made leakage current and therefore heat exponentially worse. At the same time, voltage had been scaled down to the point of being the bare minimum needed to operate the transistors, about 0.6 volts for stable transmission. The problem can be seen developing in Apple's products with larger and larger heat sinks. Then came the G5, and its tightly controlled 9 fans. By Dennard scaling, Apple and IBM correctly predicted they could hit 3 GHz with the scale down to 90 nanometers on their fresh new architecture. As per plan, they simply shrank the G5 chip from 118 to 66 square millimeters, which meant a 50% power drop to give them the bandwidth to push into 3 GHz territory. But for the reasons I mentioned, it did not work this time. Intel was having even worse problems with their early 2004 90 nanometer chips. The Pentium 4 Prescott, which users nicknamed Press Hot, that's weak, it was pulling up to 115 watts, and Power Macs weren't much better. You know, single-digit wattages were commonplace before this started happening. In May 2004, Intel publicly announced that they had hit a power wall, and increasing clock frequency was no longer a viable way to increase performance due to runaway heat. No one saw it coming. As Intel described it, they went 200 miles per hour into a brick wall. Steve tried to make the best of it for the second generation of G5 towers.
And take a look at this. Intel's gone up 12.5% in a year, and IBM's gone up 25%. So we're not thrilled about missing 3 gigahertz. But we are pleased that the PowerPC has increased its performance twice as fast as Intel, as the entire semiconductor industry has had a tough time with 90 nanometer.
Clearly, Steve was not understanding the full scope of the issue. And it wasn't just that. I've bought enough failed G5 towers to know that all this heat was seriously limiting the potential lifespan of these machines. But what could even IBM do at this point against the laws of thermodynamics? Because of Apple's attempts to defy the power wall, many G5s were doomed to die before their time.
It's not an easy thing to meet your maker. And what can he do for you? I want more life.
What about silicon-on insulator? They'd already tried it. High-K dielectric, strained silicon. Allowed the industry to continue reducing transistor size, but didn't resolve the heat problem at high clock frequency. If Apple had tried to run the G5 architecture at 3 gigahertz, it would create a thermal runaway spike so lethal the board would be dead before it left the test bench at Apple. Then parallel processing with multi-core technology would only be effective if Apple decreased the clock frequency, which they really didn't. They get rid of one discrete processor, sure, but with dual cores you've got 2 processors side by side on the same chip, and now you've got a heat issue again. But all of this is academic. Apple built the G5 tower as well as they could make you.
But not to last. The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and you have burned so very, very brightly.
That's not to say that every G5 should have died by now, not even close, but much less reliable than earlier G4 systems, either directly failing from heat or indirectly from cooling system failures. Upon technical failure, the front lamp of the G5 blinks a number of times to communicate the source of the failure. In this case, although 3 blinks indicates incompatible RAM, in fact the RAM connections have cracked from heat damage. You could reflow the solder, but it's a little more complicated to do that compared to a Mac Plus, for example. To see this being done on a Mac Plus, check out my 2012 video when you get a chance. Touch some fresh solder to the existing solder joint until it melts. Or maybe don't watch that. So in 2005, the race was on between Intel and AMD to create a dual-core chip. IBM's Power 4 from 2001 was the world's first dual-core chip, so it was no big deal to add this to the PowerPC. IBM released the 154 square millimeter 970MP that year. If we were to remove the heat spreader plate from the top of the chip, we would see the chip components and clearly defined cores. Oh, I guess they start counting at 0, don't they? These processor guys. Of course, multi-cores on the processor helped Moore's doubling law continue where Dennard scaling ended. But without simple Dennard scaling, every process generation after that point required some innovation to make possible. Each an impressive feat of ingenuity. 20 years have passed since the industry hit the power wall. Transistor counts number in the hundreds of billions. Each manufacturer trying to prove they are the best. But even Moore's law will come to an end, soon, and a whole new paradigm will be needed to make further advancements in performance. The case walls are 1/8-inch aluminum plate. Many will say it's brushed aluminum, but no, it's not. The surface is anodized, an electrochemical process that forces the surface to corrode in a very controlled fashion into a coating of aluminum oxide so it naturally resists further surface corrosion.
Anodizing is the reinforcement of a naturally occurring oxidation process and produces no harmful or dangerous byproducts.
Yeah, basically what I said. Why is anodizing so important? Here's an example. Fast forward to the Mac Pro and its hard drive carriers that I thought were the coolest design aspect of them. Even though they look like they are, these are not anodized because they will corrode from the oil on your fingers. Not so cool anymore, huh? A simple conductance test with an ohm meter will prove this. Electrical resistance should be infinite if anodized because the coating is non-conductive. And here's the drive carrier. Apple, you cheaped out. It's popular to use an additional stage of the anodizing process to color the parts as well. We saw this on my Sonnet G4 upgrade heatsink. Apple never utilized color on the G5, but did on future devices, like the current iMacs, or their handheld mobile computers known as iPad. Anodizing is supposed to resist damage too, but it doesn't seem very successful at that. It is a serious challenge to find a G5 case without damage of some sort, and you'll be competing with PC builders for good cases. Good cases that they want to gut and make into a Windows machine. Tragic. Aluminum is a soft metal, and over this many years the machine will very often get subjected to damages from careless handling, degrading its condition. If we grade G5 towers on this popular tiered ranking template, we can roughly make a scale for case condition. S is factory quality. A, slight indications of use, like 1 or 2 tiny marks or scuffs. B, a couple obvious scuffs or marks. C, the same but featuring a gouge or major scratch. D, several deep, obvious surface damages around the case. E, terrible scratches across most surfaces, plus dents or bent handles.
What'd you do?
These are the downright abusive defects you'll see on Class E cases. Then there's F. We're not even going to talk about F. Most of the time you're going to find Class B to D on the used market. And few would have the gall to sell an E or an F case except for parts or scrap metal. Unlike the earlier ABS plastic cases that you can retrobrite and repair with plumbing cement, or acrylic cases that allowed you to buff out damage, the G5 case can only go one way. Once it's damaged, it's damaged. It can't be fixed. Oh, that's just debris. If you look at the G5 chip architecture, the design intent was to be the best of both worlds between the extremes of the G4 and the Pentium 4.
Introducing the Power Mac G5, the world's fastest, most powerful personal computer.
Apple was under fire in the press, challenging that their world's fastest claim was not true in every circumstance. However, their claims of being the first 64-bit personal computer and the first to be able to access more than 4 gigabytes of memory were upheld. Okay, so it may not have been the fastest in all circumstances, but generally for creative work or hardcore math and science, it was by far the best out there. Back to the second generation, the 90nm PowerPC 970FX replaced the original 970. And with all dual processors, the low-end price went back up to $1999. So, in the middle of the second generation, they added a single 1.8 GHz model, but this time based on the new iMac G5's slower 600 MHz frontside bus design. So this tower was a clock triple discount model for $14.99 to drive sales at the low end. There's your second rogue model. Okay, I've talked about them, so now I'll ignore them. The 970FX processor would first go into the Xserve G5, announced January 2004, and shipped in March, with single or dual 2 GHz processors. In June, the new Pro Tower line was announced, hitting 2.5 GHz at the top end thanks to a liquid cooling heatsink. A computer company shipping a liquid cooling system in a stock PC was a first for the industry, parallel to the 8100-110's addition of a Peltier device for cooling, a move that was just as questionable and concerning. Neither one caught on, by the way. The 2.5 GHz was extremely hard to find initially. Although announced to be available in July, it wasn't widely available until the fall. Here's my dual 2.5 GHz, the first liquid-cooled Mac. So yeah, ignore the condition of the case. I said ignore it. It's what's inside that counts. Check this out.
Oh no!
That's just great.
It'll never run, son.
I know that.
I can tell by looking at it.
Okay, much too late, but I'm going to grab that CPU out of there. It's out. Well, this absorbent pad that Apple put in the bottom did nothing.
Damn! Whoa!
Just by looking, I can see the processor cards have been compromised. A piece of clear plastic film attempts to protect the motherboard, perhaps from potential condensation risk more so than coolant leakage. And theatrics aside, that was probably what the absorbent pad was intended for as well.
Damn!
Also, the warning label to watch for leakage got partially taken out. Even some air-cooled G5s had this warning inscribed in the steel panel. I guess it's still a valid warning, even though there's no reason it could actually happen. This liquid cooling heatsink was a combination radiator and water pump made by Delphi, a single unit responsible for cooling both processors. This coolant leak problem was very common on early units.
Yeah. We had a bunch of G5s where I worked at the time, which was the photo lab. Mm-hmm. And yeah, within like a 4-month period, they all just, the seals gave out. It was terrible.
I don't know why mine hasn't decided to blow a gasket yet.
Liquid cooling would only be available in the top-end model for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generations. I heard that. The cooling system fluid is predominantly water and glycol, with a mixture of other stabilizing chemicals, so radiator fluid. Dried, it turns into a white powder, obviously very corrosive. Uh-oh. Should have worn gloves.
Ah, the burn!
Apple also sourced a different design of liquid cooling units from Panasonic when these early Delphi units started to fail, often used as warranty replacements. It wasn't until the 4th generation Quad that they actually got it right, with Delphi now building an improved version, and a company named Coology built a dual pump version, combining 2 Delphi pumps with their own design. Improvements made seem to be use of a higher grade multi-layer hose and epoxy sealed joints, which the 2.5 obviously did not have. The 3rd generation was just a speed bump, and no one cared because it didn't hit 3 GHz. Though many felt that 2.3 GHz was the sweet spot between speed and reliability. 2 months later, in June 2005, Apple announced the decision to transition to Intel processors.
We are going to begin the transition from the PowerPC to Intel processors, and we are going to begin it for you now and for our customers next year.
Apple released a G5 tower strictly for developers, but with a 3.6 GHz Pentium 4 board inside to help them make universal binary versions of their apps. The developer transition kit was released for $9.99, another rogue model. They were required to be returned to Apple at the end of 2006 in exchange for a loaded Intel iMac.
Because we don't want them floating around out there. These are not products.
Of course a few didn't get returned. Wow, that's a lot of free space. The 4th and final generation introduced the 970MP dual-core processors and PCI Express. Being released after the Intel transition was announced, they were really designed to bridge pro customers through the Intel transition with the most modern PowerPC machines Apple would ever make, including the most powerful, the G5 Quad with 2 970MPs. A functional Quad G5 still commands relatively high prices on the used market. The air-cooled 4th generation models added a distinctive air funnel to concentrate airflow to the dual-core processor, or just to look cool. In the 1st generation, if you wanted an Apple monitor, it was the existing 17-inch, 20-inch, and huge 23-inch acrylic displays. Did it match? Metal case, mirror logo, yeah, close enough, just leave it for now. The 20-inch and 23-inch got reskinned in aluminum enclosures for the 2nd generation G5 release. So long, broken leg syndrome. They also added a ridiculously big 30-inch. Here's one in Steve Jobs' home office in 2004. Note a small model of the G5 on his desk. Though he's got a cool rustic look going there, I'm surprised his home office is kind of dumpy. But we know he's a bit eccentric, right? What's not a surprise is that he has the 30-inch because it was one of those products that clearly mesmerized him.
Yeah, first time I saw one of these, I couldn't talk for the first minute.
I have the 30-inch display as well, which I got a few years ago. A little cheaper than the initial retail price of $32.99. It took me a long time to get used to the size after using 20-inch displays up until then. This monitor series was made increasingly large not just in screen dimension, but also in thickness. And the 30-inch even needed a larger stand and thicker gauge cabling. The screen is still displaying pretty good white. The panels have a tendency to turn yellow over time. The G5 was introduced with the NVIDIA GeForce FX 5200 Ultra. God. With 64 MB RAM and plugged into an AGP 8X bus. All pretty impressive to this early G4 user. Apple had already realized that their Apple Display connector was not going to change the world and ordered a DVI option back to the video card. And the aluminum displays, of course, were DVI. But now that ADC is gone from the monitor, we're dealing with power bricks and a second power cord. The 20-inch uses a 65-watt power supply, the 23-inch has a 90-watt, and the 30-inch a 150-watt power brick. And you can substitute a power brick as long as it was higher than what was needed. So the 150-watt could run any of the three monitor sizes, but that also makes it harder to find as a spare part. If you wanted the better video card option, it only came standard on the top-end dual 2 GHz. The ATI Radeon 9600 Pro, with the same basic specs as the NVIDIA 5200, but faster and more capable, if you couldn't already tell by the relative component density on the board. Otherwise, it's hard to determine which card you even have because there's little or no branding on them to say it's ATI or NVIDIA, let alone the model. I don't know if this was by Apple's insistence or the card manufacturers not wanting to advertise on such mediocre video cards. Probably the latter. No one really had anything good to say about the 5200. No, well that too, but I'm talking about the 5200 video cards. The problem with both cards is that if you wanted to use dual DVI displays, you'd need the expensive large adapter for the ADC port. The extreme build-to-order card was the ATI 9800 Pro with 128 MB RAM. Wow. In the second generation, the 9600 Pro on the top end became the 9600 XT, doubling the VRAM. And the 256 MB ATI 9800 XT was the build-to-order option for $300. Powerful card. And a good sign that they lightened up on the branding prohibition. I see some of these in used G5s I've bought, yet even this could not run the new 30-inch display. And this heatsink totally blocks the PCI slot above it. This must have been an engineering blunder because the retail version of the card does not block the slot. Like we needed less slots.
This is so stupid.
Apple consistently put underpowered cards in the standard models. So it wasn't that better cards weren't available. They just didn't want to absorb the cost and wanted to keep the prices competitive.
And we power Pro cards. You can put in the really high-end Pro cards if that's what you want.
So the best cards were built to order, and there were a decent number of options. I could go on and on with G5 video cards, but I won't because there's just no way to make it interesting. This guy is already getting bored. Oof. Okay, let's talk USB. The G5 introduced USB 2 to the Mac universe. Apple had been hesitant to support Intel's high-speed serial connection because it was direct competition with their own technically superior standard, FireWire 400. To say that Intel won would be an understatement. But at this time, FireWire was still big on a lot of devices. Hard drives, DVD burners, cameras and camcorders, iPod, and of course iSight. FireWire was great. I was sad to see it fall to the wayside. On the back side of the removable door, this clear adhesive tape is usually still there to prevent scratching with the plexiglass air shield, especially during initial transport from the factory in China. And all doors have this pictorial instruction showing how to install RAM. Was that really worth it? Apple tried to make the steel interior structure match the aluminum, and did a good job. The acrylic door was needed to direct airflow through the case for the critically important cooling. so you can run with the aluminum door off, but as soon as you remove the second door, a red LED lights and the cooling system flips out and runs at top speed. And it's pretty obvious where the door sensor is. Due to a change in fan design, the deflector would be modified for the last release, removing the contour that held the original fan in place. They even redid the door pictorial to match. That's commitment to an obsolete product. The final release brought an end to the half AA clock batteries, now using a simple watch battery mounted near the RAM, which tend to be a lot less damaging if they blow up. Unlike the G4 design where the motherboard was mounted on the door, you will have to do a lot of digging to extract the motherboard of a G5. Reasons being, first they needed that air deflector as part of the door, and second, they were counting on the case itself to absorb some of the waste heat from the heat sinks on the back of the board. Mainly that all-important controller chip giving the G5 that incredible bus speed. We can also see heat pipes on the back of the board using the aluminum case as the heat sink. And in reverse you can see the shadow of where they pressed against the inside surface of the case. This round blower fan on the back of the media bay is actually sucking air up from behind the motherboard and blowing it out the back. And where's the power supply in all this? The power supply is out of sight, filling the entire bottom, and with two fans of its own. The 1.6 had a 450 watt power supply, but everything else had 600 watt. This stayed the same up until the 4th generation where it needed to go higher, as high as 1,000 watts on the quad. Because of the power draw, they were prevented from using a standard power cord. All 4th generation G5s needed a heavy gauge server type power cord with a foolproof machine plug. So if you get a 4th generation, make sure the power cord comes with it, or you'll have to source a generic C19 power cord. The G5 tower would inform the design of the new Mac Mini in 2005, and this case was maintained for an additional 4 generations as the Intel-based Mac Pro. August 7th, 2006, Apple ended their association with PowerPC.
Well, today, the Power Mac is going to fade into history.
And moved to 2 Intel dual-core Xeons in their tower system. So quad-core across the line.
The new Mac Pro, for the first time, we can offer one standard killer configuration that our customers are going to love. So one standard configuration, and it's an incredible config.
Though they claimed they were getting rid of the good, better, and best tiers and going to just one standard $2,499 configuration, the tiers were always based on processor speed, and they offered 3 processors. So what's the difference, Phil? Stocking one standard configuration only benefited Apple.
If you look around at the back, we've got 4 PCI Express slots.
Yeah, but you need to... Whatever. Anyway, the upshot was that the Intel-based Mac Pro would debut with a 3 GHz Intel processor at the top end.
Mission accomplished.
Of course, a hollow victory since the clock frequency race was long over. And now, so was the AIM Alliance.
I mean, you don't see the body there.
It's over.
I'll miss the checks.
Well, I'm sure he will. Hey, you're not going to do anything crazy, are you?
Oh, hell no.
Okay.
I'll be quiet.
Take care.
You don't have that candy bar on you.
No, I polished that off.
After Apple left, IBM continued to sell the 970 chip into the server and embedded markets. The Xbox 360 was released in November 2005 with a 3-core, 3.2 GHz PowerPC processor called Xenon, using a technique called clock gating to keep the heat under control. Though it had its share of heat-related problems too. The Nintendo Wii and PlayStation 3 would follow suit and adopt PowerPC as well. But the G5 was the last of the classic vintage Macs in my opinion. I mean, I'm using a 2008 Mac Pro to edit this, which is therefore not vintage.
Hey, where'd you get the hot rod, Johnny?
After the G5, the CPU was no longer a differentiator that Apple could leverage against Microsoft Windows.
And there, the
Mac is done. Woo!
It was now up to classy hardware design and OS X. So let's think about the flip side. Why are the G5s not good collection Macs? As I said in earlier videos, there's vintage Macs that are hard to find because they are so popular with collectors, and then there's actual rare ones because there were not that many made, or not that many surviving. The G5 is neither of those. There were a lot made, they take up a lot of room. A damaged case can't be refurbished. If something goes wrong inside, it's almost always irreparable. The G5 uses too much power to be a file server, and there's barely any nostalgia factor because it was generally never a family computer like the older vintage Macs were. Yet they are still fascinating for the point in computer history that they represent, the unique engineering, the striking design, and again they make great looking shelving supports. Now if you're selling a G5, it's generally valued at less than $100 with the exception of the quad. But just make sure the buyer knows this is a vintage computer or they will not be happy with the purchase.
Take your damn G5.
And if you still use one, be sure to back up your hard drive because you never know. All these moments will be lost in time, like tears in the rain. Time to die. Thanks everyone for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed my observations and thoughts on the G5. I will have an opportunity to go to Poland, so I hope to see the Apple Museum there. I see they have this lenticular G5 poster showing it with the door on and off depending on the viewing angle. Cool. Anyway, see you next time.
I thought this tour was supposed to be fun.
Stay on the side of the yellow.
Oh, come on.
No, stay.
Oh.
Alright, ready?
Yeah. Not a whole lot of torque on this thing. She turns it on, it's like, whoa.